My name is Claire. I am 33 years old and I work as a forensic accountant in Los Angeles. Right after my parents died in a sudden accident, I secretly transferred their entire $8 million estate into an irrevocable trust. It was just a professional precaution. But when my older sister called me at 6 in the morning and cheerfully told me not to come back to my own home, I realized my precaution was about to become her worst nightmare. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had a family member actively plot to steal everything you own. Trust me, you will want to hear how I handled what came next. My job is to follow the money. I track hidden assets, untangle complex webs of corporate fraud, and find the truth buried beneath carefully constructed lies. I spend my days dealing with embezzlers, scammers, and people who think they are the smartest person in the room. Because of my profession, I am not someone who operates on emotion. I operate on data logic and cold hard facts. Unfortunately, my family operated on the exact opposite. 3 months ago, my parents, Thomas and Susan Adams, died instantly in a tragic highway collision. Their sudden passing threw our lives into absolute chaos. But in the Adams household, chaos was nothing new. It was a feature, not a bug, primarily because of my older sister Audrey. It was exactly 6 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was standing in the kitchen of my parents' $3 million estate in Calabasas pouring my morning coffee. I had been living there temporarily since the funeral, trying to organize the mountains of paperwork they left behind. My phone buzzed on the marble island. It was Audrey. "Hey Claire, sweetie," Audrey said. Her voice chimed through the speaker, dripping with a sugary sweetness that immediately made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Audrey never called me sweetie unless she wanted something or was trying to cover her tracks. "What is it, Audrey?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "So listen," she said, her voice breezy and casual. "DeAndre and I hired a company to come fumigate the Calabasas house today. We found some termites near the pool house last week. We just want to take care of it before the property goes on the market, so do not come home today. The chemicals are super toxic. Just crash at your boyfriend Brian's place tonight. Love you, bye." She hung up before I could utter a single word. I stood in the silent kitchen, my coffee growing cold. A fumigation, on a Tuesday, without any prior notice, no prep work, and no tent set up outside. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to spot inconsistencies. When the math does not add up, there is always a reason. Right now, Audrey's story was a massive deficit. I set my mug down and immediately opened the security application on my phone to check the cameras installed around the perimeter of the estate. Camera 1 at the front gate was offline. Camera 2 at the driveway was offline. Camera 3 in the backyard was offline. Every single camera had been manually disconnected less than 10 minutes ago. A cold, sharp wave of adrenaline hit my chest. They were not fumigating the house. They were trying to blind me. I did not panic. I did not cry. I simply walked out to my car, started the engine, and canceled my meetings for the morning. I knew exactly what my sister and her husband were capable of. Audrey is 35 years old, breathtakingly beautiful, and the undisputed golden child of our family. While I spent my 20s hunched over spreadsheets and studying for my certification exams, Audrey spent hers traveling through Europe on our parents' credit cards. When I bought my first used car with money I saved from tutoring, Audrey was gifted a brand new luxury vehicle simply because she managed to finish her communications degree with terrible grades. In our parents' eyes, Audrey could do no wrong, especially after she gave them the one thing I had: not two perfect grandchildren. Then there was her husband, DeAndre. DeAndre is 36, a charismatic African-American man with $1 million smile, an impeccable sense of style, and the kind of natural magnetism that makes people want to hand him their wallets. He introduced himself to our family 5 years ago as a tech startup founder and cryptocurrency visionary. In reality, DeAndre was a professional parasite. Every single one of his startups crashed and burned within a year, leaving a trail of angry vendors and unpaid debts. Every single time, my parents quietly bailed him out to protect Audrey's lifestyle and keep up the appearance of their flawless family. I tried to warn my parents, to warn my... I offered to look at DeAndre's business plans. My father would just wave his hand dismissively. Claire, not everything in life is an audit, he would say. DeAndre is a visionary. You do not understand the tech world because you are too busy looking backward at receipts. I learned to keep my mouth shut. I did my job, paid my bills, and maintained a polite distance from the family circus. I knew they were greedy, but even I underestimated the sheer audacity of what I was about to walk into. They thought I was just the quiet and invisible sister who would simply step aside and let them take whatever they wanted from me. They thought their little fumigation lie would keep me away long enough for them to execute their plan perfectly. They were wrong. The drive back to the estate would normally take 30 minutes, but I was not going to let them steal my home, and I definitely was not going to be a victim. The drive back to the estate normally took 30 minutes in morning traffic. I made it in 20. My mind was racing the entire way, calculating every possible scenario and analyzing every legal loophole my sister might try to exploit. My parents had passed away without a crystal-clear, updated will, or so Audrey believed. The original document drafted over a decade ago simply split the assets equally between us. But Audrey had made it abundantly clear since the day of the funeral that she believed equal was deeply unfair. She had children, and I did not. She had a husband with a growing empire while I was just a single woman pushing numbers around a screen. In her mind, she was entitled to the lion's share of the estate. As a forensic accountant, I know how people like Audrey and DeAndre operate. They move fast when they think nobody is watching them, relying on shock and awe to bulldoze their way through legal boundaries. California law strictly prohibits self-help evictions, but people driven by greed rarely consult statutes before they act. They simply take what they want and expect everyone else to clean up the mess. I turned my car onto the palm tree-lined street leading to our property. I braced myself for a confrontation, but nothing could have prepared me for the visual assault waiting for me at the end of the driveway. There was no fumigation tent. There were no exterminators in hazmat suits. There were no warning signs posted on the front gates. Two massive commercial moving trucks were parked directly on the pristine manicured lawn my father used to obsess over. The heavy tires had already crushed the expensive landscaping, leaving deep muddy ruts in the grass. The irrigation system my father installed just last summer was smashed to pieces, with water bubbling up aimlessly into the mud. It was a scene of absolute destruction, orchestrated by people who had zero respect for the things they did not build themselves. But the ruined lawn was not the worst part. Scattered across the front driveway, sitting directly on the concrete in the morning dew, were 6 heavy-duty black trash bags. They were piled haphazardly as if they had been tossed from the front door. I pulled my car in and parked, shifting the gear with deliberate precision. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the pile. My eyes locked on those bags. One of them was partially torn open, exposing its contents to the damp morning air. I could see the familiar gray fabric of my favorite tailored blazer spilling out onto the dirt. It was a jacket I had bought to celebrate my first major promotion. Next to it, a cardboard box had been tossed on its side. It was spilling my accounting textbooks, my framed certification license, and a photograph of me and my dad from college. The glass on the frame was shattered. They had not just packed my belongings. They had literally treated my life like garbage. They had gone into my personal space, stripped it bare, and thrown my achievements onto the driveway like yesterday refuse. Easy with that piece, you idiots. That leather is custom from Milan, so do not scuff it on the doorframe. A loud, booming voice echoed from the front porch, breaking through the quiet morning. I looked up to see DeAndre. He was wearing a head-to-toe designer tracksuit that easily cost $2,000, undoubtedly purchased with the emergency credit card my mother had given him last year. He stood on the front steps, pointing aggressively at 2 exhausted movers. They were sweating and straining as they struggled to carry a massive, ostentatious white leather sectional up the steps and into my parents' home. DeAndre did not lift a finger to help them. He just stood there acting like a king overseeing his newly conquered castle. He turned his head and finally noticed my car idling in the driveway. He did not look guilty. He did not look embarrassed about being caught in a blatant lie. He just smirked, running a hand over his perfectly lined-up haircut and deliberately adjusted the heavy gold watch on his wrist so it would catch the morning light. "Well, well, look who did not listen to instructions," DeAndre called out. His voice was dripping with condescension and unearned arrogance. He walked slowly down the stone steps, his chest puffed out like a man who had just hit the jackpot with someone else's money. "Audrey told you to stay away today, Claire," he chuckled, shaking his head as if I were a disobedient child. "We got a lot of heavy lifting going on here. We did not want you getting hurt while we handle the grown-up business." I stood my ground, feeling the cool morning breeze bite through my silk blouse. I refused to let him see even a fraction of the anger boiling inside my chest. "In my line of work, you never show your cards until the trap is fully set." I ignored his childish taunt and kept my eyes locked on his face, scanning his expression for the slightest hint of nervousness. There was none. He truly believed he had already won. "What is this, DeAndre?" I asked. My voice was dangerously calm, echoing sharply in the driveway. "Why are your things being moved into my parents' house? And why are my belongings sitting in garbage bags on the concrete?" DeAndre let out a loud, mocking laugh. He stepped up to stand just a few feet away from me, looking down with a patronizing smile. "See, that is your problem, Claire. You are always focused on the fine print. You are asking useless questions when you should be calling a cab to haul your trash away. You think a piece of paper stops us. We are officially moving in here today, no matter what you say or do, period." "Correction," a female voice chimed in from the doorway, cutting through the morning air like a silver knife. Audrey stepped out onto the expansive front porch. She was wearing perfectly pressed silk pajamas and an oversized cashmere cardigan. In her hand, she held a crystal flute filled to the brim with a bright orange mimosa. It was barely past 7 in the morning, and my sister was already day-drinking champagne in the very house our parents had unexpectedly died in just 3 months prior. She walked to the edge of the stone porch, looking down at me with the exact same sneering superiority she had used to dismiss me since we were teenagers. "It is not your parents' house anymore," Audrey said, taking a slow and deliberate sip from her crystal glass. Her eyes swept over my ruined belongings on the driveway with absolute zero remorse. "And those trash bags are out there because that is exactly where they belong." We needed the master suite cleared out immediately. DeAndre needs a much larger home office to host his cryptocurrency investors, and my kids need the entire East Wing for their new playroom. "You are just taking up valuable real estate." I stared at her, fascinated by the sheer lack of human empathy operating behind her perfectly made-up face. "You are moving in," I stated, letting the harsh reality of her words settle into place. "Without consulting me, the legal co-owner of this estate. You just decided to evict your own sister and toss my life onto the driveway like yard waste. Oh, stop being so dramatic." Audrey sighed, rolling her eyes as if my sudden homelessness was just a minor inconvenience to her lovely morning. "You are a single woman, you have no husband and you have no kids. What do you possibly need a 6,000 square foot mansion for?" To echo. "DeAndre and I have a real family. We have an important image to maintain in this community. It makes perfect sense for us to take the house. It is exactly what Mom and Dad would have wanted for their grandchildren." "Image does not pay the annual property taxes," Audrey had replied coldly, keeping my posture straight. "And neither does DeAndre's fake crypto portfolio. You do not have the legal right to touch this house, let alone evict me from it without a formal court order." DeAndre let out another loud, mocking laugh, stepping up to stand closely beside his wife. He wrapped a possessive arm around Audrey's waist, looking down at me like I was a stubborn tenant who had missed rent for 6 months. "See, that is your fundamental problem, Claire. DeAndre said, shaking his head with a sickeningly patronizing smile. You are always focused on the rules. You are always looking at the fine print while the real players in this world are making moves. This house belongs to us now. The whole estate does. You just need to pack up your little bags and find a nice quiet studio apartment downtown. I crossed my arms, feeling the cool morning breeze bite through my silk blouse. Is that so? I asked. Because the last time I checked the deed, my name was still firmly printed on it, alongside yours. You cannot just wish away established property rights, DeAndre. Even someone with your highly creative approach to business and finance should know that basic legal fact. Audrey's smirk widened into a full-blown grin of pure malice. She reached into the deep pocket of her luxurious cashmere cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of thick, legal-sized paper. She held it up between two perfectly manicured fingers, waving it back and forth in the morning air like a winning lottery ticket. You are right, Claire. We cannot just wish it away, Audrey said, her eyes flashing with triumphant cruelty. But Mom and Dad could. And they did. She walked down the porch steps, her silk pajamas rustling as she approached me. She shoved the folded document directly against my chest, forcing me to take it or let it fall to the ground. I grabbed the paper, my forensic accountant instincts instantly kicking into high gear. Read it and weep, little sister Audrey whispered, leaning in close so I could smell the champagne on her breath. It is a fully executed power of attorney and an updated will. Mom and Dad signed it just 2 days before their accident. They finally realized that leaving half of their legacy to a bitter single woman was a terrible investment. They left everything to me. The house, the accounts, the cars, all of it. You get absolutely nothing. I unfolded the heavy paper. The morning sun illuminated the black ink. I scanned the first page, noting the standard legal boilerplate language that anyone could download from the internet for $50. It claimed to grant Audrey full and immediate control over the Addams family estate, superseding any previous documents. But as my eyes moved down to the signature lines at the bottom of the page, my analytical mind immediately caught the glaring anomalies. I did not gasp. I did not scream. I did not fall to my knees and beg my sister for mercy. Instead, I let a profound, icy silence stretch between us. Audrey and DeAndre stood there waiting for my inevitable emotional breakdown. They were waiting for the tears that would validate their cruel victory. They wanted me to shatter right there on the crushed grass of the Calabasas lawn. But they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. They saw a quiet sister they could easily bully. They did not see the seasoned investigator who spent her entire professional life dissecting financial fraud and destroying white-collar criminals. I looked at the signatures again, committing every flawed pen stroke to memory. The trap they thought they had built for me was actually a cell they had just locked themselves inside. I held the document up to the morning light, letting my eyes trace the contours of the ink. In my profession, we do not just read papers, we dissect them. We interrogate them. A fraudulent document always tells a story if you know exactly where to look. Audrey was practically vibrating with excitement, anticipating my total collapse. She wanted me to scream and cry. She wanted the satisfaction of breaking me completely. But my brain had already shifted into a cold and analytical gear. I was no longer a grieving daughter looking at her parents' final wishes. I was a forensic accountant examining an active crime scene. The first thing that struck me was the paper itself. It was standard 20-pound copy paper. My father was a man who obsessed over details and presentation. He never signed anything important unless it was printed on heavy watermarked parchment. He used the same estate lawyer for 30 years, a meticulous man who bound every document with heavy brass staples. This document was fastened with a cheap silver paperclip in the top left corner. It was sloppy. It was amateurish. It was exactly the kind of corner DeAndre would cut to save time and money. Then I looked at the signatures at the bottom of the page. The names Thomas Addams and Susan Addams were written in thick black ink. I focused on my father's signature first. To the untrained eye, it looked like a reasonable match. The sweeping capital letter at the front and the sharp, angular finish were certainly modeled after his handwriting. But a forger always focuses too much on making the letters look visually correct, forgetting about the actual physical mechanics of the human hand. My father suffered from severe rheumatoid arthritis. His hands ached constantly, especially in the early mornings. His signature had degraded from a smooth, confident swoop into a series of jagged and hesitant strokes. The signature on this paper was entirely too fluid. It was applied with a steady, even pressure that my father had not possessed since I was in my 20s. The person who signed this document gripped the pen tightly and dragged it across the page with unbroken momentum. It was a biologically impossible signature for a man with severe degenerative joint disease. Next, I examined my mother's signature. My mother was a woman of intense vanity. She had a very specific way of signing her name, looping the letters into a grand flourish that almost resembled a figure 8. But the signature on this page lacked her signature flair. It was stiff and overly cautious. The forger had clearly traced it, stopping and starting at unnatural points to make sure the proportions matched perfectly. There was a microscopic pooling of ink at the top of the final letter where the pen had rested for a fraction of a second too long. Real signatures flow like water. Forged signatures stutter like a nervous liar. But the most damning piece of evidence was not the handwriting. It was the notary stamp placed just below the dates. I ran my thumb over the raised seal. The stamp belonged to a public notary named Kevin Brooks. The commission expiration date listed was December of next year. I knew exactly who Kevin Brooks was because he was DeAndre's drinking buddy. He hung around their weekend pool parties trying to pitch terrible business ideas. More importantly, I knew that Kevin had his notary commission revoked by the state of California 6 months ago for rubber stamping fraudulent car loan documents for one of DeAndre's failed startups. This document was not just a fake, it was a felony. In the state of California, forging a will and presenting it as a legitimate legal instrument carries severe criminal penalties. My sister and her husband had just handed me physical proof of their own impending incarceration. They had gift-wrapped their own prison sentences and shoved them directly against my chest. "Well?" Audrey snapped, crossing her arms over her cashmere cardigan. "Are you done staring at it? The reality is staring you right in the face, Claire. You have zero legal rights to this property. You need to call a cab and get off my driveway before I have DeAndre call the police." I slowly folded the heavy paper in half and then in quarters. I looked up at my sister, meeting her gaze with absolute deadpan calm. I did not blink. I did not let a single ounce of emotion leak into my voice. "You are incredibly confident for someone holding a piece of copy paper, Audrey," I said smoothly. "You really think Mom and Dad changed their entire estate plan just 2 days before their fatal car crash? And they did it without their longtime estate attorney present. They just happened to use DeAndre's buddy Kevin to notarize it." DeAndre stepped forward, his jaw tight. "It is fully legal, Claire. They wanted to make sure their real family was protected. They knew you would just hoard the money. They wanted Audrey to have it so she could support the kids and invest in my companies. You can take us to court if you want, but you will lose." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch. I needed them to commit to this lie entirely. If I pointed out the flaws in the forgery, they might panic and destroy the evidence. They might try to claim it was a misunderstanding. I needed them to submit this fraudulent document to the probate court. I needed them to commit perjury on the public record. Only then would the trap snap shut permanently. Before I could deliver my response, the sound of tires crunching on the pavement broke the tension. A sleek black sports car turned into the driveway, navigating carefully around the trash bags scattered across the concrete. I recognized the car immediately. It was Brian. My loyal boyfriend of 2 years had finally arrived to save the day. The sleek black sports car idled for a brief second before pulling forward into the driveway. I felt a fleeting rush of profound relief wash completely over my tight chest. Brian was a brilliant corporate consultant, a man who truly understood contracts, negotiations, and the aggressive tactics of ambitious people. He knew exactly how to handle men like DeAndre. I had sent him a quick and urgent text message earlier this morning when I first saw the security cameras go offline, telling him I was heading to Calabasas because something felt wrong. I assumed he had rushed over to support me to stand by my side while I dealt with my sister and her parasitic husband. Brian turned off the engine and stepped out of his car. He was wearing his signature navy blue suit, perfectly tailored without a single wrinkle. He looked sharp and professional, exactly the kind of man you want in your corner during a crisis. He closed his car door and adjusted his tie. I took a step toward him, expecting him to look at the massive moving trucks and the scattered trash bags with the same disgust I felt. I waited for the outrage. I waited for him to put a protective arm around my shoulders and demand answers from Audrey. Instead, Brian did not even look at me. His eyes bypassed my face completely and locked onto DeAndre, who was still standing on the top step of the porch. Brian walked forward. He moved with a relaxed, confident stride. He approached the pile of garbage bags containing my personal belongings. My favorite blazer was still dragging in the dirt. My shattered framed photograph was gleaming in the morning sun. Brian did not pause. He did not show an ounce of concern for my ruined items. He simply sidestepped the black plastic bags, lifting his expensive leather shoes carefully to avoid scuffing them on the debris of my life. Claire, Brian said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of urgency. You need to take a deep breath and calm down. I froze. My analytical mind, which had been running at lightning speed, suddenly hit a brick wall. I watched in absolute disbelief as Brian walked right past me. He climbed the stone steps of the porch, closing the distance between himself and the two people who had just tried to illegally evict me. DeAndre grinned broadly, showing all his teeth. He extended his hand. Brian reached out and grasped it firmly. The two men engaged in a vigorous, familiar handshake. DeAndre even reached over with his other hand and clapped Brian on the shoulder like they were old fraternity brothers reuniting at a tailgate party. Audrey took another sip of her mimosa and smiled warmly at my boyfriend. "Good morning, Brian," she purred. "I am so glad you made it. We were just trying to explain the new living arrangements to Claire, but she is being incredibly stubborn." Brian nodded sympathetically at my sister. "I know, Audrey. I will handle her." He turned around to face me. He was standing shoulder to shoulder with DeAndre and Audrey, presenting a united front. The three of them looked down at me from the elevated porch. They were the reigning monarchs of the Calabasas estate, and I was the annoying peasant refusing to leave the courtyard. "Claire, we need to look at this situation logically," Brian said. He used his best corporate negotiation voice, the one he reserved for calming down difficult clients. Audrey and DeAndre have a growing family. They have 2 children who need space to run and play. DeAndre has multiple business ventures that require a substantial home office for hosting important investors. You have a great job downtown. You do not need a 6,000 square foot house. It makes perfect logistical sense for them to take over the primary residence. I stared at him. The man I had shared my life with for 2 years was standing on my parents' porch, defending the people who had just tossed my possessions onto the concrete. I processed his words carefully. He was not acting under duress. He was not confused about the situation. He was actively participating in the gaslighting. Logistical sense, I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "Brian." They disconnected the security cameras. They hired moving trucks without telling me. They threw my clothes into garbage bags. They are trying to enforce a forged power of attorney to steal my inheritance. Since when do you support criminal fraud? Brian let out a long, exasperated sigh. He pinched the bridge of his nose, acting as if my very valid legal concerns were just the hysterical ramblings of an emotional woman. "Claire, you are overreacting. I saw the updated will yesterday. Audrey showed it to me. It looks perfectly standard." Thomas and Susan obviously realized that providing for their grandchildren was the most responsible financial decision they could make. "You should be happy for your sister. Family is supposed to support each other." The pieces of the puzzle began snapping into place with terrifying speed. "He said he saw the will yesterday," That meant Brian had known about this eviction plan before I even woke up this morning. He had known Audrey and DeAndre were going to ambush me. He had known they were going to throw my things onto the driveway. He had known all of it, and he had chosen to stay silent. "You saw the will yesterday," I stated, locking my eyes onto his. My heart was pounding, but my exterior remained completely frozen. "You met with them behind my back." "We had a productive dinner," Brian said smoothly, slipping his hands into his suit pockets. DeAndre and I had a chance to really talk about the future. We discussed business. We discussed family dynamics. We all agreed that a smooth transition of the property would be the best outcome for everyone involved. "You are a smart woman, Claire. You must accept this." I stared at the man I planned to marry. "You sat down with people forging documents to steal my inheritance and discussed family dynamics," I said. "What did they promise you, Brian?" He shifted, smoothing his suit jacket. "Claire, you are letting emotions cloud your judgment. This is exactly why your parents left the estate to Audrey. They knew you would fight over every penny. We are building a legacy. You are acting selfish right now." "Selfish," I said. "My parents died 90 days ago. My sister dumped my clothes onto the driveway in garbage bags. She holds a fake power of attorney that a disgraced notary stamped. And you stand on my porch telling me I am selfish." Brian shook his head with disappointment. "See, this is what I mean, Claire. You are completely paranoid. Your sister just wants to provide a stable home for her children. You have a great career. You do not need a mansion. As a forensic accountant, I know that when someone accuses you of being crazy, they are hiding their own guilt. Gaslighting is another form of fraud. It is an emotional Ponzi scheme designed to make the victim doubt their own reality." I stepped closer, keeping my eyes locked on his face. "I am observant, Brian," I said coldly. "You never liked DeAndre. For 2 years you called him a grifter and a joke. You told me his business plans were empty buzzwords. So why are you defending his right to live here? What is the price tag on your loyalty?" DeAndre chuckled, wrapping his arm tighter around Audrey's waist. "Come on, man. Tell her," DeAndre prompted. "Tell her about the big moves we are making. We are keeping the wealth inside the family now." Brian stood up straighter, looking proud of himself. "DeAndre and I finalized a partnership last night, Claire. He is going to be the angel investor for my new consulting firm. Once Audrey liquidates the investment accounts, DeAndre is injecting $500,000 in seed capital into my business." The betrayal struck me like a physical blow. $500,000. That was the exact price of his integrity. Audrey and DeAndre dangled an imaginary carrot in front of him, and he sold me out without a second thought. He traded our relationship for a fake investment check from a man who never successfully launched a single company. "It is a smart business move," Claire Brian continued, shifting into a persuasive pitch. "With that capital, I can open my own office downtown. I can hire a dedicated team. We can start building the life we talked about. DeAndre sees my vision. He respects my expertise. If you stop fighting your sister, we could all benefit from this estate." I looked at Audrey, watching the exchange with absolute delight. She successfully turned my partner against me. She had isolated me completely. In her mind, she orchestrated the perfect coup. She had the house, the forged will, the fraudulent power of attorney, and the unwavering support of the man I loved. She thought she destroyed my defenses. "You sold me out for $500,000, I stated. I kept my voice flat, analyzing the situation purely as a transaction. "You helped them plan this illegal eviction because they promised to fund your startup." Brian frowned, looking genuinely offended by my blunt assessment. "I did not sell you out, Claire. I secured our future. Your parents' money is going to fund my company and provide for us. You are just upset because you are not the one calling the shots. You need to stop acting like a victim and start acting like a supportive partner." DeAndre is giving me an incredible opportunity. "An incredible opportunity," I repeated. My mind was already calculating the profound irony of his statement. Brian thought he had secured a golden ticket. He thought he was walking away with $500,000 of my parents' money. He had no idea that the money he was banking on simply did not exist. He had no idea DeAndre was making promises with an empty bank account. Audrey took another sip of her mimosa, her eyes gleaming with triumph. So are you going to pack up your trash and leave peacefully, Claire? Or do we need to call the authorities to remove a trespasser? Brian is right. You need to accept reality. The estate belongs to us now. The cash belongs to us. You are completely out of the equation. I stood on the driveway surrounded by the scattered remains of my personal life. The three of them stared down at me from the porch, a united front of greed and betrayal. They expected me to break. They wanted me to beg. They needed me to surrender so they could enjoy their stolen wealth in peace. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not beg, and I do not surrender to amateur criminals. I looked at Brian, internalizing the finality of his betrayal. You are right, Brian, I said softly. My voice carried across the crushed grass, reaching the porch perfectly clear. You have made a brilliant business decision. You should definitely partner with DeAndre. I am sure his crypto investments will yield amazing returns for your new firm. Brian smiled, visibly relieved that I was finally seeing reason. Exactly, Claire. I knew you would understand once you thought about it logically. We are going to be incredibly successful. I am absolutely sure you will be, I replied. I turned away from the porch and looked straight down at the garbage bags on the concrete. I reached down and picked up the shattered frame containing the lovely photograph of my father. I brushed the dirt off the glass, holding it carefully against my chest. I did not scream. I did not fight them for the house today. I already had everything I needed to destroy them completely. I just had to let them hang themselves now. I held the broken picture frame against my chest, feeling the jagged edges of the shattered glass pressing into my silk blouse. Audrey, DeAndre, and Brian watched me from the elevated porch, expecting a dramatic outburst. They wanted a screaming match. They wanted me to fall to my knees and beg for my childhood home, or plead with Brian to reconsider our relationship. That is the reaction they needed to validate their cruel victory. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not deal in theatrics. I deal in calculated responses. I turned my back to the porch and walked toward the pile of black garbage bags scattered across the concrete driveway. I moved with deliberate slowness. I crouched down and began untying the plastic knots. My hands were perfectly steady. DeAndre laughed loudly from the steps. Look at her, Brian. She is actually digging through the trash. I told you she would fold quickly. Just let her take her little bags and go. We have a lot of furniture to move today. I ignored his voice. I sifted through the bags until I found my heavy leather work briefcase. It was scuffed but intact. I pulled it out and slung the strap over my shoulder. Then I stood up and walked straight toward the front door. Hold on a second, Audrey snapped, stepping directly into my path as I reached the top of the stairs. Where do you think you are going? You do not live here anymore, Claire. I suggest you get back to your car and drive away before things get ugly. I stopped on the top step, so we were standing eye to eye. I need my encrypted work laptop and my physical client files, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. They are highly confidential corporate assets. If you touch them or attempt to withhold them, I will not call the police for a simple property dispute. I will call the federal authorities and report you for corporate espionage and theft of proprietary financial data. Do you want the FBI at your housewarming party, Audrey? Audrey swallowed hard, her confident smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. She glanced at Brian, who gave her a slight nod. Fine, Brian said, stepping aside to clear the doorway. Get your work computer and get out. But do not try to take anything else. The estate assets stay right here. I walked past them and stepped into the foyer of my childhood home. The moving company had already started tearing apart the living room. Expensive rugs were rolled up and shoved into corners. The antique grandfather clock my parents cherished was pushed carelessly against the drywall. I did not let the destruction register in my mind. I walked straight down the hallway toward the small guest bedroom I had been using since the funeral. Audrey followed closely behind me, her expensive slippers slapping against the hardwood floors. She leaned against the doorframe, watching me like a hawk as I grabbed my heavy encrypted laptop from the desk. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out my portable fireproof safe, which contained my passport, my social security card, and my personal banking tokens. I placed them carefully into my leather briefcase. "You really are pathetic, Claire," Audrey sneered, watching me zip the bag closed. "You are just going to pack up your little computer and leave." I expected more of a fight from the smart sister, but I guess you finally realized you cannot beat me. Mom and Dad always liked me best. They knew I deserved this lifestyle. They knew I was meant for greater things than you. I did not respond. I adjusted the strap of my briefcase and turned to face her. She looked so triumphant standing there in her silk pajamas clutching her morning cocktail. She honestly believed she had outsmarted me. She honestly believed that forged piece of paper was a golden ticket to generational wealth. I walked past her, brushing my shoulder against hers. I made my way back down the hallway and out the front door. DeAndre and Brian were waiting on the porch, chatting about venture capital funding like they were already millionaires. They stopped talking when I stepped outside. "Did you get your little spreadsheets?" DeAndre mocked, crossing his arms. "Good, now get off my property." I walked down the stone steps and stopped at the bottom. I looked at the three of them standing together. They were a perfect trinity of greed, betrayal, and staggering stupidity. They had no idea what they had just initiated. They had no idea that their entire future was currently resting on a foundation of sand. I looked directly at my sister. "You are right, Audrey," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "You have completely outplayed me. I cannot fight that power of attorney. So I am not going to try." Audrey's eyes lit up with pure malicious joy. She took a celebratory sip of her mimosa. "Glad you finally understand your place, Claire." I shifted my gaze to DeAndre and then to Brian. "Enjoy the house." I continued, keeping my tone completely even. "Enjoy the cars and the furniture. Enjoy the inheritance. I hope you spend it all. I hope you make huge investments, Brian. I hope you throw the biggest parties, DeAndre. You should celebrate. You earned this." Brian frowned slightly, sensing a shift in my tone, but unable to identify the threat. "We will, Claire," he said defensively. "We are going to build a massive empire." "I am sure you will," I replied. I turned around and walked to my car. I placed my briefcase in the passenger seat and laid the picture frame on top of it. I got behind the wheel and started the engine. I did not look back. I did not shed a tear. I backed out of the driveway, leaving my ruined clothes in the dirt. I drove away today. I did not check into a hotel to cry. I drove to my office in downtown Los Angeles. My office is my sanctuary. It is a place where every debit has a corresponding credit and the truth is written in black ink. When people experience profound betrayal, they usually seek comfort in friends or therapy. I seek comfort in spreadsheets. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not gaslight you on a front porch, and numbers certainly do not forge signatures to steal your childhood home. This confrontation on the driveway was not a surprise to me. Audrey and DeAndre thought they were executing a brilliant ambush. They thought their forged power of attorney was a masterstroke of criminal genius. But they were operating on an assumption that I was blind to their true nature. The reality is that I had been auditing my own family for the past 2 years. It started exactly 24 months ago during a routine Sunday dinner at the Calabasas estate. My father asked me a casual question about capital gains taxes regarding a commercial property he sold earlier that year. He handed me a folder of bank statements to look over. He was a smart man, but his financial literacy was rooted in a different era. He trusted people too much. As I flipped through the statements looking for the specific transaction he asked about, a different line item caught my eye. It was a wire transfer for $250,000. The recipient was listed as an entity called Apex Innovation Holdings. I did not say anything at the time. I simply memorized the employer identification number listed next to the transaction. That night, I ran a background search through my firm databases. Finding the truth took me less than 45 minutes. Apex Innovation Holdings was not a legitimate tech company. It was a shell corporation registered in Delaware. The registered agent was a post office box, and the sole managing member was DeAndre. That single wire transfer was the loose thread. Once I pulled it, the entire fabric of my parents' financial security began to unravel. Over the next 6 months, I treated my family like a covert corporate investigation. I spent my evenings and weekends pulling public records, tracking property deeds, and analyzing offshore asset transfers. I mapped out every business venture DeAndre claimed to be running. The picture that emerged was terrifying. DeAndre was not an entrepreneur. He was a financial parasite systematically bleeding my parents dry. He would pitch an aggressive business idea to Audrey, usually something involving blockchain or artificial intelligence. Audrey would then go to our parents crying about how DeAndre just needed one big break to become a billionaire. She would manipulate their guilt, playing the card of the struggling young mother, trying to secure her children's future. My parents, desperate to maintain the illusion of their perfect golden child, and her successful husband would write the check. DeAndre funneled the money through a labyrinth of shell companies. He created fake invoices, paid himself consulting fees, and expensed luxury vacations. When the money ran out, he would declare bankruptcy, close the shell company, and start the cycle all over again with a new buzzword-filled pitch. I watched millions of dollars vanish. I watched my parents drain their investment accounts to fund DeAndre's designer wardrobe and Audrey's shopping sprees. At one point, I tried to intervene. I printed out a 50-page dossier detailing the fraud and presented it to my father in his study. I showed him exactly how DeAndre was washing the funds. I proved that the startups were legally bankrupt. My father looked at the documents, and then he looked at me with an expression of profound exhaustion. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who knew he was being robbed, but was too tired to lock the door. "Claire, you need to understand something," my father said, sliding the dossier back across his heavy wooden desk. "Audrey is fragile. If we cut DeAndre off, she will take the grandchildren and leave. She will blame us. We are just keeping the peace. It is only money. It is only money." That sentence shattered the last remaining illusion I had about my family. My parents were not victims of a sophisticated scam. They were willing participants in their own financial ruin. They paid millions in ransom just to keep Audrey happy and ensure access to their grandchildren. They chose the comfortable lie over the ugly truth. From that day forward, I stopped trying to save them. A forensic accountant cannot rescue clients who actively want to be defrauded. I stepped back and watched the slow-motion car crash. I knew the Calabasas estate was becoming a massive financial burden. I knew DeAndre was pushing them for more capital every single month. I knew the entire facade was crumbling. When my parents died 3 months ago, I did not just lose my mother and father. I instantly became the only obstacle standing between DeAndre and the rest of the Adams estate. I knew they would come for me. I knew they would try to cut me out because they were desperate. DeAndre had burned through the last infusion of cash weeks before the funeral, and Audrey had never worked a day in her life. They needed the house, and they needed the remaining liquid assets to sustain their fraudulent lifestyle. They thought I was unprepared when they tossed my clothes onto the driveway. They thought Brian had delivered the final crushing blow to my spirit. But they forgot one crucial detail about my profession. An accountant never walks into a meeting without knowing how it will end. I had spent 2 years preparing for this exact war. Every move they made today was predictable. Every lie they told was documented. I drove away, not in defeat, but in absolute control. The trap was already set. The trap was already set. Sitting in my office, I booted up my secure workstation and pulled up the master file I had named Operation Parasite. It contained 2 years of meticulous financial tracking detailing every single dollar DeAndre had stolen from my parents. As a forensic accountant, I do not deal in vague accusations. I build timelines. I follow the digital breadcrumbs that white-collar criminals always leave behind because they are never as smart as they think they are. DeAndre was a textbook case of malignant narcissism mixed with profound financial illiteracy. He started his campaign against my parents' wealth 5 years ago with a company he called Quantum Horizon Technologies. The pitch was brilliant in its sheer emptiness. He claimed to be developing an artificial intelligence algorithm that would predict real estate market fluctuations. Audrey brought him to Sunday dinner, armed with a glossy presentation folder filled with stock photos and meaningless graphs. My parents were mesmerized. They wrote a check for $400,000 as seed capital. He hired no developers and bought no servers, instead, transferring everything into a Nevada shell company. From there, the money was systematically drained over 8 months. He leased a luxury sports car and bought custom suits and diamond watches. The remaining funds were categorized as executive consulting fees, which went directly into his personal checking account to fund Audrey's extravagant lifestyle. When the company inevitably collapsed, DeAndre did not apologize. He sat at our dining table eating an expensive steak and told my parents the global market was simply not ready for his advanced technological vision. He immediately pitched his next venture. This time it was a revolutionary cryptocurrency. He convinced my father that traditional banking was dead and that early adoption was the only way to secure generational wealth. My father, liquidating a portion of his retirement portfolio, handed over another $600,000. DeAndre was running a classic pump and dump scheme, but he was doing it entirely with his father-in-law money. He created phantom digital wallets to simulate trading volume, making the coin look active and valuable. Then he quietly sold off his own worthless tokens, pulling real cash out of the ecosystem and funneling it into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He was not just burning through their cash. He hid the disappearing funds by generating fake quarterly earnings reports. I found these on a shared cloud drive. He had literally downloaded generic financial templates from the internet and altered the numbers using basic graphic design software. He changed negative margins to positive yields with a few keystrokes. My parents, blinded by their desperate need to see Audrey married to a successful titan of industry, never once questioned the amateurish formatting. The scams grew increasingly reckless as DeAndre realized there were no consequences. After the crypto failure, he pitched a boutique logistics app. Then he tried a subscription box service for luxury pet accessories. Each failure required more capital to fix, and my parents kept paying the ransom. They remortgaged commercial properties they had owned outright for decades. They bled their own foundation dry. I mapped out the entire network of shell companies. DeAndre used registered agents in Delaware and Wyoming to obscure his ownership. He established corporate layers that were specifically designed to confuse basic audits. He created fake vendor invoices, paying companies that did not actually exist for services that were never rendered. I found massive monthly payments for marketing consultations, software architecture, legal advisory, retainers, and digital brand development, all expertly routed back to offshore accounts, completely controlled by DeAndre. He was literally paying himself to pretend he was running a legitimate business. The sheer volume of forged documents required a staggering amount of deliberate daily effort. The total amount stolen over 5 years reached a staggering $4.2 million. That was just the principal. Factoring in lost investment yields and the interest penalties my parents incurred from liquidating assets prematurely, the true cost of DeAndre's existence was closer to $6 million. While Audrey paraded around Calabasas hosting lavish charity luncheons and boasting about her brilliant husband, her actual life was entirely funded by elder financial abuse. She was an active accomplice. In my investigation, I uncovered emails between Audrey and DeAndre discussing exactly how much money my father had left in his primary brokerage account. Audrey would calculate the balance and tell DeAndre precisely how much to ask for in his next fake investment pitch. They orchestrated the bleeding together. They thought their tracks were perfectly covered because my parents refused to press charges while they were alive. They assumed that without my parents around to testify, the financial history would simply be buried alongside them in the cemetery. They severely underestimated my professional capabilities. I had subpoenaed banking records, collected metadata from their fake invoices, and archived every deleted email before they even realized I was looking. I stared at the glowing screen in my office, taking a slow sip of black coffee. The file was a loaded weapon. If I handed it to the federal authorities, DeAndre would face decades in prison for wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. Audrey would be indicted as a co-conspirator, but giving the file to the authorities today would be too easy. It would end the game before they truly understood the magnitude of their defeat. White-collar criminals like DeAndre are driven by ego. They thrive on the illusion of superiority. To destroy them completely, you cannot just lock them in a cell. You have to strip away their power, their audience, and their stolen wealth all at the same time. You have to let them climb to the very top of their imaginary mountain before you cut the rope. My parents were dead, but their money was not. And the money was the only thing Audrey and DeAndre actually cared about. It was time to execute the next phase of the operation. The groundwork for this trap was laid exactly 90 days ago, on the very afternoon I identified my parents' bodies at the county morgue. While Audrey was hysterically crying in the waiting room, and DeAndre was outside pacing the parking lot making frantic phone calls to his creditors, I was standing in silence processing the brutal reality of our new family dynamic. I knew the moment the funeral concluded they would turn their predatory focus entirely onto the estate. I knew they would try to drain the final remaining assets to cover the massive debts DeAndre had accumulated. I needed to move faster than they could even think. 2 days after the crash, before the obituaries were even printed, I drove straight to the office of my parents' longtime estate attorney, Jonathan Bradley. Jonathan was a meticulous old-school lawyer who had handled the Adams family legal affairs for 3 decades. He knew about my parents' reckless financial enabling of DeAndre, but his hands were legally tied while they were alive. When I walked into his office that morning, I brought the original copy of my parents' will. This document, drafted 12 years ago, clearly designated me as the sole executor of the estate. My parents had known even back then that Audrey lacked the basic competence to handle complex financial distributions. As the designated executor, I had a fiduciary duty to protect the estate assets from misappropriation. I sat across from Jonathan and laid out my extensive forensic file detailing DeAndre's ongoing fraud. I showed him the offshore accounts, the shell companies, and the millions of dollars that had already vanished. Jonathan's face turned pale as he reviewed the ledger. I told him I needed to lock down the remaining liquid assets immediately before my sister and her husband attempted a hostile takeover. We pulled the current balances of my parents' primary investment portfolios and savings accounts. The total remaining liquid wealth was exactly $8,500,000. If I left that money in standard brokerage accounts, Audrey would eventually find a way to access it. She would hire aggressive lawyers, claim she was owed compensation for her children, or, as I correctly predicted, resort to forging legal documents to seize total control. I needed a financial fortress that could withstand any legal assault. I instructed Jonathan to establish an irrevocable trust. In the realm of wealth management, an irrevocable trust is the ultimate defensive weapon. Unlike a revocable trust which can be altered or dissolved by the creator, an irrevocable trust is set in stone the moment it is signed. Once assets are transferred into it, they no longer belong to the estate. They belong entirely to the trust itself as an independent legal entity. It cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the permission of the beneficiaries, and sometimes not even then. More importantly, assets held within an irrevocable trust are completely shielded from creditors' lawsuits and fraudulent claims. Even if someone produces a later will or a fake power of attorney, it is completely useless. You cannot bequeath or seize money that the estate no longer legally owns. Jonathan drafted the trust documents with ruthless precision. I was installed as the sole managing trustee, granting me absolute authority over how and when any funds would be dispersed. Audrey and her children were listed as conditional beneficiaries, but the conditions were deliberately stringent, designed to block any bulk withdrawals. The money could only be used for direct educational or medical expenses paid strictly to the institutions and never directly into Audrey's hands. DeAndre was explicitly excluded from accessing a single cent under any circumstances whatsoever. The transfer process was executed with absolute secrecy. Over the next 48 hours, I systematically liquidated my parents' primary stock portfolios and drained their high-yield savings accounts. I routed the $8,500,000 directly into the secure bank accounts managed by the newly established Irrevocable Trust. I left no paper trail at the Calabasas house. While I executed this massive transfer of wealth, Audrey and DeAndre were busy browsing expensive luxury car catalogs. They were already spending the inheritance in their minds. They assumed the money was just sitting in a checking account, waiting for the probate court to release it into their greedy hands. They never suspected that the quiet sister they constantly belittled was actively moving millions of dollars right under their noses. Creating the trust was not just about securing the money. It was about creating an impenetrable legal barrier that would expose their criminal behavior when they inevitably tried to break through it. If they presented a fake will to claim the money, they would be committing felony fraud to steal an empty box. I was insulating myself from their chaos. The beauty of the irrevocable trust is its absolute finality. Their forged power of attorney would not matter. The Calabasas property was a separate issue, but the family wealth was already locked behind an impenetrable wall of corporate law. I had amputated their financial lifeline before they even realized they were bleeding. I spent weeks leading up to the funeral watching them play their roles. I watched DeAndre wear a custom-tailored black suit, pretending to mourn the man he had systematically robbed. I watched Audrey dab dry eyes while whispering about the massive inheritance she was about to receive. I sat in the back pew of the church, composed, knowing that their entire future was built on an illusion. They thought they were predators. They thought they backed me into a corner by securing Brian's betrayal. But my trap was buried so deep in the financial bedrock they could not even perceive it. The money was safe. Now it was time to deploy the bait. The money was safe. Now it was time to deploy the bait. In my line of work, you learn that the most dangerous thing you can do to a scammer is leave them with absolutely nothing. If Audrey and DeAndre hacked into my parents' bank portal and saw a balance of zero, they would panic immediately. A zero balance triggers pure survival instincts, making people paranoid. They would hire aggressive litigators, demand a full accounting of the estate, and start tearing the city apart, looking for the missing millions. They might even try to subpoena me or track down the irrevocable trust before I was ready to reveal it. To prevent that, I had to give them a victory. I had to manufacture a specific sum of money large enough to look like a plausible remainder of a heavily indebted estate, but small enough to be completely useless for sustaining their lifestyle. I needed to trigger their dopamine receptors so intensely that they would forget to do any actual due diligence. Enter the decoy account. Before locking down the estate, I deliberately left my parents' primary checking account open. I funded it with exactly $50,000. $50,000 is a fascinating number in forensic accounting. To a normal working-class person, $50,000 is a life-changing amount. To wealthy people, it is pocket change. But to fake wealthy people like my sister and her husband, $50,000 is the ultimate psychological trigger. It is just enough money to buy a few designer handbags, lease a luxury sports car, or throw an incredibly lavish party. It is immediate gratification, disguised as generational wealth. I knew exactly how their financially illiterate minds would process that number. When they logged into the banking portal using my parents' stolen passwords, they would see the $50,000 and their eyes would light up. They would assume this was simply the liquid cash meant for immediate household expenses. They would convince themselves that the rest of the millions were tied up in the physical equity of the Calabasas house or pending a routine release from the probate court. Because DeAndre always pretended to be a financial genius, he would never admit to Audrey that he did not actually understand how estate transfers work. He would confidently assure her that the $50,000 was theirs to spend right now while the lawyers sorted out the rest of the fortune. I also deliberately left two of my parents' high-limit credit cards open and active. I knew they would find the physical cards in my father's desk drawer. I knew they would see the available credit limits and view them as free money. In their minds, they were already multimillionaires holding a forged power of attorney. They would max out those credit cards under the arrogant assumption that they could just pay off the balances once the rest of the estate settled into their accounts. This decoy account was not just a distraction. It was a carefully constructed psychological snare designed to buy me time and force them to commit fully to their own destruction. Time was my most valuable asset. I needed time for them to comfortably settle into the Calabasas mansion. I needed time for them to start bragging to their social circle about their newfound wealth. I needed time for them to firmly establish their fraudulent dominion over the property. More importantly, I needed them to actually spend the decoy money. The moment Audrey transferred a single dollar from that checking account using her forged power of attorney, she upgraded her crime from attempted fraud to actual executed wire fraud. Every time DeAndre swiped one of those credit cards, he was committing identity theft and elder financial abuse. They were actively generating a flawless, undeniable paper trail of federal crimes, and they were doing it with a smile on their faces. I could perfectly predict how they would burn through the bait. Audrey would immediately hire interior decorators to redesign the master suite she had just violently evicted me from. DeAndre would start buying expensive bottles of champagne and hosting catered dinners to impress his fake cryptocurrency investors. And then there was Brian. DeAndre had promised my traitorous ex-boyfriend a $500,000 seed capital investment. Brian was a corporate consultant who worshipped money above all else. DeAndre would undoubtedly show Brian the $50,000 balance and spin some elaborate lie about how it was just the first small tranche of capital clearing the bank. Brian, blinded by his own greed and his desperate desire to join the elite investor class, would swallow the lie whole. They were all going to feast on the $50,000 like starving wolves fighting over a scrap of meat. They would drain that checking account in a matter of days. They would push the credit cards right to their maximum limits, buying expensive clothes, imported furniture, and luxury car rentals to maintain their wealthy facade. Sitting in my downtown office, I monitored the decoy account through a secure read-only portal. I watched the numbers tick down in real time. $3,000 to a luxury furniture rental company, $5,000 to a landscaping firm to fix the mud ruts their moving trucks had left on the lawn, $8,000 to a boutique catering service for a massive upcoming event. They were moving with reckless speed, consumed by the illusion of victory. They thought they outsmarted the quiet accountant's sister. They thought they had stolen the entire Addams family legacy. They had no idea they were just rats happily chewing on the cheese inside a reinforced steel trap. The snare was perfectly executed. The money was bleeding out exactly as I had modeled in my spreadsheets. Now I needed to secure the final most important piece of the puzzle, the Calabasas mansion itself. The Calabasas mansion was the crown jewel of our family image. My parents treated that property like a sacred monument to their success. It featured an infinity pool, imported marble countertops, and sweeping mountain views. Audrey always believed she would inherit it free and clear. She paraded around the driveway this morning, acting as if she had just been handed the keys to a paid-off fortress. She assumed my parents owned it outright because they always projected invincible wealth. But wealth is often just an illusion constructed by debt, and my parents were masters of that particular mirage. During my secret audit of their finances, I did not just look at bank statements. I pulled the property records from the Los Angeles County Assessor's Office. What I found hidden in the public filings completely validated my worst fears about DeAndre's influence over them. 14 months ago, when DeAndre pitched his disastrous pet subscription box service, my parents ran out of liquid cash to fund his delusions. But they could not bear to tell their golden child no. Instead of cutting him off, they made the most reckless financial decision of their lives. They took out a high-interest second mortgage on the Calabasas house. They bypassed traditional banks because their debt-to-income ratio was spiraling completely out of control. Instead, they went to a private hard money lender. They borrowed $2.5 million against the house equity, agreeing to an exorbitant interest rate to get cash quickly. The funds transferred to one of DeAndre's shell companies and subsequently vanished into his offshore accounts. My parents gambled their residence on a con artist and lost. By the time they died in the car crash 3 months ago, that hard money loan was severely delinquent. They had missed 4 consecutive payments. The private lender had already issued a formal notice of default. The Calabasas mansion was teetering on the absolute brink of foreclosure. If the lender initiated final proceedings, the house would be auctioned off to the highest bidder, and my family would be publicly humiliated. Audrey and DeAndre had absolutely no idea about the impending foreclosure. They never bothered to check the mail or review my parents' financial liabilities. They just assumed the massive house was a free asset waiting for them to move in. When Audrey shoved that forged power of attorney against my chest, she thought she was stealing a $3 million asset. She did not realize she was legally attaching herself to a defaulted $2.5 million liability. But I could not leave the fate of the house to a random private lender. If the house went to public auction, Audrey might find some sleazy investor to bail her out, or she might tie up the eviction in court for years claiming squatters' rights. I needed absolute total control over the property. I needed to become the executioner. 2 weeks after the funeral, I contacted the private lending firm that held the promissory note. Hard money lenders are not in the business of sentimentality. They want their capital returned with a profit, and they hate dealing with the messy probate process of deceased clients. I presented myself not as a grieving daughter, but as a corporate representative of an anonymous investment group. I offered to purchase the distressed debt outright, buying the promissory note and the deed of trust for the full remaining balance plus a premium. I did not use my parents' money to buy the debt. That would be illegal mingling of trust assets. I used my own money. Over my 10-year career as a forensic accountant, I had built a very comfortable personal fortune. I liquidated my own stock portfolio and utilized my own business capital. I formed a holding company, an anonymous limited liability company, registered in Wyoming, where privacy laws shield the identities of corporate officers. I named the company Obsidian Asset Management. Through Obsidian Asset Management, I wired $2.6 million to the private lender. The transaction cleared seamlessly. The lender transferred the promissory note to my LLC. In the eyes of the law, Obsidian Asset Management was now the official lien holder of the Calabasas estate. I became the bank. I owned the mortgage. Because the loan was already in deep default, I held the unilateral right to foreclose on the property and seize the asset at any moment of my choosing. Audrey thought she evicted me from my childhood home. In reality, she had just moved all of her expensive furniture, her custom leather sofas, and her entire life into a house that I personally owned the debt on. She was trespassing on my collateral. The legal brilliance of this maneuver was intoxicating. By forging the will and the power of attorney, Audrey had legally declared herself the sole owner and operator of the Adams estate. In doing so, she accepted all the liabilities attached to it. When I drop the foreclosure hammer, she will not be able to claim ignorance. She will not be able to distance herself from the debt. The bank, which is secretly me, will come to collect, and she will have absolutely nothing to pay with because she will have already burned through the $50,000 decoy account. I sat at my desk opening a fresh legal folder. I printed out the formal notice of sale for the Calabasas property. I drafted the eviction orders under the Obsidian Asset Management letterhead. Everything was prepared and legally bulletproof. I needed to wait for the perfect moment to serve the papers. I wanted them to unpack every single box. I wanted DeAndre to set up his lavish home office. I wanted Brian to feel completely secure in his new partnership. I wanted them to host a massive party to show off their stolen wealth to the neighborhood. That would be the exact moment I arrived to tear their world apart. I watched their financial suicide unfold in real time through my secure accounting portals. Audrey and DeAndre behaved exactly like starving animals suddenly tossed into a butcher shop. They had no impulse control, no strategic planning, and absolutely no respect for the money they thought they had stolen. The $50,000 decoy account I left them acted as an accelerant to their massive egos. Within 48 hours of illegally evicting me from the Calabasas mansion, they initiated a spending spree that defied all basic logic. First, Audrey hired a celebrity interior design firm to completely overhaul the master suite. She authorized a $15,000 wire transfer from the checking account just as a retainer fee. She ripped out the custom mahogany fixtures my parents had cherished and replaced them with sterile white marble and cheap gold accents. I saw the charges pop up on the surviving credit cards. $4,000 for velvet curtains, $7,000 for a custom mattress. She was maxing out the credit limits under my deceased father's name, committing blatant identity theft, with every single swipe of the plastic. She truly believed that once the probate court finalized her forged paperwork, the millions would flood in to wipe away these temporary debts. DeAndre was equally reckless. He immediately began playing the role of the Silicon Valley titan, operating out of his newly stolen headquarters. He purchased massive curved monitors, ergonomic leather chairs, and a ridiculous conference table that cost $8,000. He paid for it using the second credit card. He was setting up a stage to impress his fake cryptocurrency investors. But the most satisfying part of my surveillance was watching Brian ruin his own life. Brian, the man who had sold our 2-year relationship for a phantom $500,000 seed investment, fully embraced his new partnership. Through mutual contacts in the corporate consulting world, I learned that Brian had formally submitted his resignation at his prestigious firm. He had burned his bridges, telling his senior partners that he was launching his own elite venture capital fund with a prominent angel investor. He signed a commercial lease for a high-rise office space downtown, putting down a massive personal deposit. He was operating on the absolute certainty that DeAndre's check would clear by the end of the month. Brian was so blinded by his own greed that he never bothered to ask for proof of funds. He just saw DeAndre standing on the porch of a $3 million estate and assumed the wealth was real. By the end of the first week, the decoy account was hemorrhaging cash. They spent money on a private chef to prepare daily meals because Audrey declared that cooking in her new mansion was beneath her. They leased 2 new luxury vehicles, putting down heavy cash deposits from the checking account to secure the keys. Every time I refreshed the banking portal, I smiled. They were not just spending money, they were eagerly weaving the rope that would hang them. The $50,000 dwindled to 30, then 15, then 5. They were riding the high of the illusion, completely oblivious to the cliff edge approaching in the dark. Then came the ultimate display of their arrogance. Audrey sent out digital invitations for an exclusive housewarming and launch party. The invitation boasted about DeAndre's new corporate headquarters and celebrating the next chapter of their family legacy. She invited all of my parents' wealthy neighbors, the country club members, local socialites, and DeAndre's network of amateur scammers. Brian invited his former corporate colleagues, eager to show off his new status as a venture capital player. They wanted a captive audience to witness their coronation. The party preparations drained the last remaining drops of the decoy account. I tracked the final transactions. They hired a premium catering service featuring a caviar bar and imported Wagyu beef. They booked a live jazz band and a popular local disc jockey to play by the infinity pool. They even rented massive floral arches and custom lighting to illuminate the driveway where my belongings had been dumped just days prior. When the checking account finally hit zero, they simply pivoted to the credit cards, pushing them past their absolute limits. The bank authorized the overages because of my parents' historically flawless credit scores. Sitting in my quiet office, I watched the final available credit dollar vanish. The trap was now fully loaded, and the spring was pulled back to its maximum tension. They had absolutely nothing left. Their personal accounts were dry, the estate accounts were empty, the credit cards were completely tapped out. They had surrounded themselves with luxury goods they did not own and invited the elite of Los Angeles to celebrate a wealth they did not possess. The day of the party arrived, bringing a spectacular California sunset. I opened my social media accounts from a burner profile and watched Audrey broadcast her false victory to the world. She posted videos holding a crystal champagne flute, walking through the redesigned master suite. She posted photos of DeAndre and Brian standing by the pool, smoking expensive cigars and laughing like kings of the universe. Her captions were dripping with toxic positivity. Feeling so blessed to step into my true purpose, building generational wealth with my amazing husband. The universe rewards those who manifest greatness. She manifested nothing but her own criminal indictment. I closed my laptop and slowly stood up from my heavy wooden desk. I walked over to the coat rack and slipped on my absolute sharpest black tailored suit. I grabbed my thick leather briefcase containing the foreclosure documents, the fake bank statements, and the necessary police warrants. I walked out to my car, safely unlocked the doors, and started the engine. The deeply entitled golden child had enjoyed her beautiful illusion for long enough. The glowing orange sun was going down over Calabasas, and it was time to collect the final debt. The glowing orange sun was going down over Calabasas, and it was time to collect the final debt. The drive through the winding canyon roads was exceptionally peaceful. I rolled my windows down, letting the cool evening breeze circulate through the car. The sky shifted from a brilliant gold into deep hues of purple and bruised magenta, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured estates. When I turned onto my parents' street, the sheer scale of Audrey's arrogance became immediately visible. A barricade of luxury vehicles lined the entire block. Ferraris, Porsches, and sleek black SUVs were parked bumper to bumper. A professional valet service had set up a glowing podium at the base of the driveway, efficiently taking keys from the arriving elite of Los Angeles. I bypassed the valet stand and parked my sedan slightly down the street, hiding it in the shadows of a massive oak tree. I turned off the ignition and sat in the quiet cabin for a moment, just listening. The heavy thumping bass of a live disc jockey blended seamlessly with the smooth melodies of a jazz saxophone. Laughter and the sharp clinking of crystal glasses drifted over the tall wrought iron gates. They were throwing a spectacular coronation. I grabbed my heavy leather briefcase from the passenger seat. I stepped out of the car and adjusted the collar of my black tailored suit. My heels clicked against the asphalt with a steady rhythmic precision as I walked toward the front gates. The floral arches framing the entrance were massive cascades of white orchids and imported roses. I slipped past the distracted security guards hired to check invitations. The property was completely transformed. The backyard terrace overlooking the infinity pool was packed with hundreds of guests. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos navigated the crowd carrying silver trays piled high with beluga caviar and seared Wagyu beef. A towering pyramid of champagne glasses dominated the center of the patio, illuminated by custom LED lighting that matched the color of the pool. Audrey was holding court near the outdoor fireplace. She wore a custom designer gown covered in hand-stitched sequins that caught the light with every movement. She looked radiant, completely intoxicated by the validation of her wealthy peers. I watched her greet the wives of prominent local real estate developers, kissing cheeks and accepting gushing compliments about the newly renovated master suite. She pointed toward the house, bragging loudly about her brilliant design choices and how she and DeAndre were finally building their family legacy. On the opposite side of the pool, DeAndre was surrounded by a tight circle of men in expensive suits. He held a thick cigar in one hand and a glass of scotch in the other. He was loudly pitching his latest phantom cryptocurrency venture to a group of amateur investors and local socialites who were desperate to find the next big tech unicorn. DeAndre was in his element, feeding off their greedy energy. He spun elaborate lies about blockchain integration and decentralized finance, throwing out complex technical terms that meant absolutely nothing. The men around him nodded vigorously, captivated by his effortless confidence and the sheer display of wealth surrounding them. They assumed the mansion was proof of his immense success. They had no idea it was the very instrument of his impending ruin. My eyes scanned the dense crowd until I found the final piece of the fraudulent trinity. Brian was standing near the outdoor marble bar, surrounded by several of his former colleagues from the corporate consulting firm he had just dramatically quit. He was wearing a brand new bespoke suit and a luxury watch that easily cost $20,000. He leaned against the counter, looking incredibly smug. I moved closer, slipping into the shadows of a large potted palm tree to listen to his conversation. Brian was projecting his voice, making sure everyone within a 20-foot radius could hear his arrogant boasting. He told his former partners that corporate consulting was a dead end for people with no real ambition. He bragged loudly about his new venture capital fund, claiming he had already secured a massive $500,000 seed investment from a highly exclusive angel investor. He gestured casually across the illuminated patio toward DeAndre. He spoke about his new downtown office lease and the aggressive hiring spree he was about to launch. The men around him looked envious, hanging on to his every word, hoping he might throw them a lucrative job offer. Brian drank it all in, completely convinced he had leveled up in the financial world. He truly believed he had outsmarted me, traded up for a better life, and secured his permanent place among the elite. He was selling them an illusion funded entirely by an empty checking account and maxed-out credit cards. I gripped the handle of my heavy leather briefcase, feeling the profound weight of the legal documents inside. Every single person on this luxurious terrace was actively participating in a massive financial hallucination. They were dancing happily on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, completely blind to the rising water. The music swelled loudly as the hired DJ transitioned to an energetic new track. A spontaneous cheer erupted from the intoxicated crowd, celebrating a legacy built entirely on theft and deception. I looked at the floral arrangements that cost more than my first car ever did. I looked at the hired catering staff serving imported delicacies paid for by stolen credit. The sheer audacity of their performance was truly breathtaking, but it was time to end the show. I took a deep breath. I stepped out of the comforting shadows of the palm tree and walked directly into the bright glowing lights of the main patio area. The time for silent observation was officially over tonight. The meticulous forensic accountant had finally arrived to audit their stolen lives. The executioner was standing right in their backyard, perfectly ready to collect every single outstanding debt. I walked past the edge of the infinity pool, my black heels clicking with a sharp, rhythmic intensity against the imported travertine tile. I did not come alone. Flanking my right side was Jonathan Bradley, my parents' longtime estate attorney, holding a heavy leather briefcase identical to mine. Flanking my left side was Captain Miller from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, White Collar Crime Division. He was in full uniform, his badge catching the elaborate purple and gold lighting that Audrey had rented for her fake coronation. My entrance was not subtle. The visual contrast of a woman in a severe black business suit, accompanied by a uniformed police officer and a stern lawyer, immediately disrupted the party atmosphere. The guests closest to the pool parted like the Red Sea. Whispers rippled through the crowd, spreading faster than a spilled cocktail. People stopped eating their expensive caviar. They lowered their champagne flutes. The hired disc jockey, sensing the sudden shift in the energy of the room, abruptly faded out the upbeat dance track, leaving an eerie, uncomfortable silence hovering over the entire patio. Audrey was mid-laugh when she finally saw me. She was standing by the outdoor fireplace, surrounded by the wives of prominent local real estate developers. Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The crystal flute in her hand shook slightly, spilling a few drops of orange mimosa onto her custom sequined gown. She excused herself from her wealthy admirers and marched directly toward me, her designer heels stomping aggressively against the stone patio. DeAndre and Brian noticed the sudden silence at the same time. They stopped bragging to their fake investors and turned their heads. When they saw the police uniform walking beside me, their relaxed, confident postures evaporated. DeAndre tightened his grip on his scotch glass, while Brian suddenly looked like he wanted to sink into the floorboards. Both men immediately broke away from their groups and hurried over to intercept me before I could reach the center of the patio. "What are you doing here?" Audrey hissed, stepping directly into my path. She kept her voice low, trying to maintain the illusion of control in front of her high society guests. "I told you to stay away from this property, Claire. You are trespassing. Security. Where is the security I hired to keep the trash out?" I did not flinch. I looked at her completely unbothered by her aggressive posturing. "You hired 2 college students to stand by the front gate and check digital invitations, Audrey." I said, my voice perfectly calm and carrying easily in the quiet night air. They were highly unequipped to stop a sworn law enforcement officer and the legal executor of the Adams family estate from entering the premises. DeAndre arrived at Audrey's side, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to look intimidating. He glanced nervously at Captain Miller before focusing his anger on me. "You need to leave right now, Claire," DeAndre demanded, trying to project authority. "This is a private event. Private. We are hosting important investors tonight. You are disrupting our business operations. I will not ask you nicely again." Brian stepped up next to DeAndre, running a hand nervously through his hair. His eyes darted between the police officer and my attorney. "Claire, this is highly inappropriate," Brian said, his voice tight with anxiety. "We already had this discussion on the porch. You agreed to leave peacefully. Coming back here with the police is a massive overreaction. You are going to ruin the professional relationships we are building here tonight." I looked at the 3 of them standing together in their expensive clothes paid for entirely by fraudulent credit card swipes and stolen funds. They were still desperately clinging to the illusion that they were in charge. They thought they could bully me into retreating just like they had done a week ago. They had no concept of the legal avalanche that was currently hanging directly over their heads. I agreed to walk away from a forged power of attorney because arguing with amateur criminals on a driveway is a waste of my highly billable time, I replied. My tone was clinical and detached, slicing through their arrogance like a scalpel. "I told you to enjoy the house. I told you to throw a massive party. I specifically told you to celebrate. And you did exactly what I wanted you to do. You followed my instructions perfectly." Audrey glared at me, her chest heaving with indignation. "You are insane, Claire. You have absolutely no authority here. Mom and Dad left everything to me. I have the signed paperwork to prove it." Jonathan Bradley stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of certified court documents stamped with official government seals. "With all due respect," Audrey, Jonathan said, his deep voice resonating with decades of legal experience, "the documents you submitted to the probate court are fraudulent. The notary public you used had his commission revoked 6 months ago, making the stamp entirely invalid. Furthermore, the signatures of your late parents do not match any known historical records. We have already filed formal contestation motions, and the probate judge has issued an immediate injunction against your claims." Audrey snatched the papers from Jonathan's hand, scanning the dense legal text. Her eyes widened as she read the injunction order. DeAndre leaned over her shoulder, his confident facade cracking as he saw the official court stamps. "This is a mistake," DeAndre stammered, looking at Brian for support. "We filed everything correctly. My guy Kevin took care of it. This lawyer is just trying to scare us." Captain Miller finally spoke, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. "I am here to ensure no property leaves this estate, while an active criminal investigation into financial fraud is fully conducted tonight." The word fraud echoed across the illuminated patio, striking the crowd like a physical blow. DeAndre took a sudden step backward, his designer sneakers scraping the stone tile. His group of amateur investors suddenly shifted, creating physical distance between themselves and the man they thought was a visionary. I turned my attention entirely to DeAndre. Tiny beads of moisture gathered at his hairline, ruining his groomed appearance. "You have been telling everyone tonight about your massive capital injection," I said. "You promised Brian a $500,000 investment. You told these gentlemen you were self-funding." DeAndre swallowed hard, but his ego refused to surrender. "I am self-funding it," he shot back, his voice shaking. "The probate judge is just confused by your dirty tactics. The money is ours. We have the accounts. Audrey has the credentials. The cash is sitting right there." I smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile that made Brian flinch. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the first bright red folder, extracting a single sheet of paper. It was a certified bank statement printed from my secure forensic accounting portal. "You are absolutely right, DeAndre," I said, holding the paper up. "Audrey does have the credentials. She logged in 7 days ago and saw the balance. Because neither of you understands wealth management, you assume that account held everything." I shoved the bank statement directly against DeAndre's chest, mimicking the exact aggressive motion Audrey used on the driveway. He grabbed the paper reflexively. "Read the balance, DeAndre," I commanded. "Read it out loud. Tell Brian exactly how much capital you have." DeAndre's eyes darted down to the paper. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The paper trembled violently in his hands. "Read it," I demanded, my voice cracking like a whip. Audrey rushed forward, grabbing her husband's arm. "DeAndre, what does it say?" she asked, her voice shrill with rising panic. "Show it to me." He could not speak. He just let the paper slip from his fingers. Brian lunged forward and snatched it out of the air before it could hit the patio floor. Brian scanned the document, his eyes searching for the millions he had banked his entire future on. "This says zero," Brian whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant confidence. "The available balance is zero. The ending balance is zero. The overdraft limit is maxed out." I took a deliberate step toward my treacherous ex-boyfriend. "Yes, Brian," I said. "The account was zeroed out at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon when the caterers charged the final deposit. Do you want to know the starting balance when they illegally evicted me? Exactly $50,000. Audrey's jaw dropped open. She looked at me with wild, uncomprehending eyes. 50,000, she gasped. "No, that is impossible. Mom and Dad had over $8 million in liquid investments. I saw the statements last year." "Where is the rest of the money, Claire? What did you do with it?" "I protected it," I replied smoothly. "Before you could forge documents or hire moving trucks or drain my parents' life savings to pay off your husband's debts, I executed my legal duty. I moved every single cent of the $8.5 million into a secure, irrevocable trust. I am the sole managing trustee. You have absolutely no access to it. It is legally untouchable." The silence on the patio was absolute. Even the gentle breeze seemed to stop. "I left you a decoy account. Audrey," I continued, explaining the trap with ruthless precision. "I left $50,000 to see what you would do. And you did exactly what parasites do. You fed on it. You spent it on interior design retainers, luxury car leases, and this ridiculous party to impress people who do not even like you. You burned the bait instantly." Brian looked like he was going to vomit. He stared at the bank statement in his shaking hands and looked at DeAndre. "You promised me $500,000. Brian yelled, his professional demeanor shattering. "I quit my job, DeAndre. I signed a 5-year commercial lease. I put down a massive personal deposit." DeAndre took another step back, bumping into the edge of the outdoor marble bar. "Man, you have to understand," DeAndre stammered, throwing his hands up defensively. "I thought the money was coming. Audrey said she had the power of attorney. We were going to be rich." "You were never going to be rich, DeAndre," I corrected him, my voice ringing with finality. "You were always going to be a fraud. And now everyone here knows it." The group of amateur investors who had been drinking DeAndre's expensive scotch immediately set their glasses down. They did not say a word. They turned around and began walking swiftly toward the valet stand, fleeing the blast radius. Brian watched them go, his own future disintegrating right in front of his eyes. He traded a loyal partner for a man who could not even afford his own suit. Audrey let out a guttural scream of frustration. She lunged forward, trying to slap me across the face, but Captain Miller stepped effortlessly between us. He held up a single gloved hand, and Audrey's self-preservation instincts finally kicked in. She stopped dead in her tracks, breathing heavily. "You cannot do this to us, Claire," Audrey cried, her voice cracking with desperate rage. "You cannot take the money. But we still have the house. The will gives me the house. This estate is worth $3 million. We can sell it. We can take out loans against the equity. You cannot throw us out onto the street." I smiled again. This time it was not just cold, it was triumphant. I reached back into my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out the second red folder to finish them. I opened the second red folder, letting the thick parchment paper catch the elaborate patio lighting. But before I could present the foreclosure documents, Brian completely snapped. The once polished corporate consultant who always prided himself on absolute control was now hyperventilating. His expensive, bespoke suit suddenly looked exactly like a cheap costume on a desperate man. He suddenly lunged forward toward DeAndre, grabbing the lapels of his designer track jacket. "Where is all my money?" DeAndre Bryan screamed. His voice cracked loudly, echoing over the perfectly silent infinity pool. "You personally showed me the bank portal yesterday. You said the $500,000 was clearing this morning. You told me the wire transfer was already approved." DeAndre tried to shove Brian away, but his physical intimidation tactics failed. Brian was running on pure terror. "Man, back off!" DeAndre shouted, batting at Brian's hands. "I did not know she locked the main accounts. Audrey told me the paperwork was bulletproof. We will figure it out. Give me a few days to make calls. I have other investors lined up. We can still launch your firm. You do not have other investors," Brian roared, his face turning crimson. "You do not have anything. I resigned from my senior partnership yesterday, DeAndre. I signed a 5-year commercial lease downtown. I put down a non-refundable deposit of $80,000 using my personal savings because you swore the seed capital was guaranteed. I am completely ruined." The realization hit Brian with the force of a freight train. He let go of DeAndre's jacket and stumbled backward, running both hands through his perfectly styled hair. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, pleading desperation. "Claire," he begged, taking a step toward me. "Claire, please. You have to tell them this is a mistake. You have to release the funds. We were going to build a future together. You cannot let my career go up in flames over a misunderstanding." I looked at the man who had sold our relationship for a fraudulent check. "There is no misunderstanding, Brian," I replied, my voice echoing across the patio. "You made a calculated business decision to partner with a known con artist. You chose to assist my sister in an illegal eviction because you wanted a shortcut to the elite investor class. You traded your integrity for a payout that never existed. I am not going to save you from the consequences of your own greed. Your career is not my responsibility." The crowd of elite guests and amateur investors had seen enough. The moment I confirmed that the money was locked in an irrevocable trust and that DeAndre was entirely broke, a massive wave of self-preservation washed over the patio. Wealthy people treat bankruptcy and fraud like a highly infectious disease. No one wanted to be photographed at a party hosted by a man about to be indicted for wire fraud. The exodus was immediate and ruthless. The men who had been hanging on to DeAndre's every word just 10 minutes ago silently set their expensive Scotch glasses down on the marble bar. They did not say goodbye. They simply turned their backs and walked swiftly toward the front gates, pulling their valet tickets out of their pockets. The wives of the local real estate developers who had been kissing Audrey's cheeks grabbed their designer handbags and hurried down the driveway, refusing to make eye contact with my sister. DeAndre watched his fake empire crumble in real time. The validation he craved more than oxygen was walking out the front gates. "Wait," DeAndre called out, his voice pitching upward with panic. "Where are you all going? The party is just starting. The caterers are bringing out the main course. We have a live band. We are still making moves here. I have an artificial intelligence logistics platform ready for beta testing. I am taking early seed round applications tonight." Nobody stopped. Nobody ever even looked back. The silence of their departure was far more devastating than any insult they could have hurled. DeAndre was left standing by the outdoor fireplace holding a lit cigar that was quickly turning to ash. His audience was gone. His leverage was gone. His identity as a visionary tech founder evaporated into the cool California night air, leaving behind nothing but a broke scammer in a borrowed mansion. Brian sank onto one of the white leather lounge chairs near the pool, burying his face in his hands. He was hyperventilating, audibly muttering about his commercial lease and his ruined professional reputation. He had traded a six-figure salary and a loyal partner for absolute financial devastation. He would be facing breach of contract lawsuits from his new landlords by the end of the month, and no respectable consulting firm would ever hire a man who fell for a blatant amateur scam. Audrey stood paralyzed, watching the mass exodus of her high society guests. The people she had desperately tried to impress were fleeing her home like it was on fire. She looked at the abandoned caviar stations and the half-empty champagne flutes scattered across the patio tables. She looked at Brian weeping on the outdoor furniture, and then she looked at DeAndre, who was staring blankly at the front gates. The illusion was completely shattered. But I was not finished. The financial humiliation was only the first part of the audit. I looked at Audrey, who was trembling in her custom sequined gown. She still believed she held one final trump card. She still believed the forged will gave her physical ownership of the $3 million Calabasas estate. She thought she could just sell the property and escape the blast radius. I stepped forward, my black heels clicking against the stone tile, cutting through the sounds of Brian's muffled sobbing. I opened the red folder in my hands and pulled out the foreclosure notice. I prepared to deliver the second devastating strike perfectly. Audrey stood tall, trying to summon the last remaining shreds of her golden child entitlement as the cool night breeze swept completely across the silent outdoor patio area. She crossed her arms over her ruined sequined gown, lifting her chin in a pathetic display of defiance. "You can keep your stupid trust fund!" Claire Audrey spat, her voice trembling, but loud enough for the police officer to hear clearly. "We do not need the liquid cash anyway. Mom and Dad left me this beautiful estate. The will clearly states that I am the sole inheritor of the real property. This mansion is worth at least $3 million on the open market. DeAndre and I can list it tomorrow morning. We can sell it, pay off whatever debts we have, and still walk away with a massive profit. You cannot touch the house. It is mine." I looked at her with a profound sense of genuine pity. Her entire worldview was built on a fairy tale that never actually existed. "Audrey, you really should have hired a competent real estate attorney before you decided to forge those inheritance documents," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You see, when you illegally transferred the estate into your name, you assumed you were inheriting a fully paid-off asset. You assumed our parents owned this Calabasas mansion free and clear because they always projected an image of invincible wealth to keep you happy. But wealth is often just an illusion constructed by debt." I held up a thick stack of stapled papers from the red folder. 14 months ago, when DeAndre ran out of money for his ridiculous pet subscription box service, our parents could not bear to cut him off. But their cash reserves were completely depleted, so they did the most reckless thing imaginable. They took out a high-interest second mortgage on this exact property. They borrowed $2.5 million from a private hard money lender and handed it straight to your husband. Audrey blinked rapidly, the information refusing to process in her mind. "That is a lie," she snapped, pointing an accusing finger at me. "Mom and Dad would never mortgage their dream home. They loved this house more than anything in the world." I shifted my gaze to DeAndre, who was now leaning heavily against the marble bar, looking like he was about to pass out entirely. "Tell her, DeAndre," I commanded. "Tell your wife about the $2.5 million wire transfer that went into your Nevada shell company last year." DeAndre swallowed hard, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Babe," he mumbled, avoiding Audrey's eyes completely. "The investors pulled out of the pet logistics app. We needed bridge capital to keep the servers running. Thomas said he would handle it. I did not know he leveraged the house." "You did not know because you never cared to ask," I interrupted sharply. "You just blindly took the money and burned it all. And because you burned it, my parents missed 4 consecutive mortgage payments before they died." This property was severely delinquent. The lender issued a formal notice of default 2 months ago. You are not standing in a $3 million asset, Audrey. You are standing inside a $2.5 million liability. Audrey's hands began to shake uncontrollably. She looked frantically around the patio at the expensive rented furniture, the towering floral arrangements, and the catering stations she could no longer afford. "Fine," she suddenly yelled, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria. "Fine. If the house is in default, then the bank can deal with it. The bank will have to take us to court to evict us. We know our rights. We can file for bankruptcy protection. We can tie this up in the legal system for years. You still do not get to kick us out tonight, Claire. The bank has to follow a massive legal process." I smiled, letting the cold reality of her situation settle over the patio. "You are absolutely right, Audrey," I agreed, my voice echoing in the quiet night. "The bank does have to follow a legal process. But hard money lenders hate dealing with messy probate issues. They just want their capital returned quickly. So 2 weeks ago, a private holding company called Obsidian Asset Management approached the lender and offered to buy the distressed debt outright. The lender happily agreed and transferred the promissory note and the deed of trust over to the new corporate entity holding the massive debt." I pulled the final certified document from the red folder and held it out toward her. "Obsidian Asset Management is a registered limited liability company in Wyoming," I explained, articulating every single syllable with lethal precision. "And I am the sole managing member of that company. I did not just protect the cash, Audrey. I used my own personal fortune to buy the debt on this house. I am the lien holder. I am the actual bank. And because the loan is in terminal default, I hold the unilateral right to foreclose and seize the collateral immediately, without further delays." Audrey stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. She finally realized the absolute magnitude of her massive defeat. By forging the will and claiming the estate, she had legally accepted all of its toxic debt. She had moved her entire family into a house that I personally controlled. "You do not own this mansion, Audrey," I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. "My company owns it. You and your husband are currently trespassing on my corporate collateral, and I am officially executing the eviction right now. Captain Miller, it is now time to clear my private property." Captain Miller stepped forward, moving with the heavy and absolute authority that only a seasoned law enforcement officer possesses. His heavy black boots thudded against the imported travertine tile, signaling the immediate end of the polite conversation. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder, turning the volume down slightly, before addressing my sister and her husband. "You heard the lady, Captain Miller," said his voice, a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded instant obedience. "This property is now under the legal control of Obsidian Asset Management. You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your essential personal items and vacate the premises. If you are still standing on this patio in 16 minutes, you will be placed in handcuffs and formally charged with criminal trespassing." Audrey let out a choked gasp, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. Her hands flew to her mouth, her perfectly manicured nails pressing into her pale cheeks. She looked at the police officer and then at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, terrified disbelief. "You cannot do this at night," Audrey cried, her voice entirely stripped of its former arrogant entitlement. "Where are we supposed to go? Our children are sleeping upstairs in their bedrooms. You cannot throw toddlers out onto the street in the middle of the night. I kept my posture rigidly straight, completely immune to her sudden weaponization of my niece and nephew. Your children are not upstairs, Audrey, I replied coldly. I had my attorney contact our Aunt Diane 3 hours ago. She picked the kids up from their daycare center and took them to her house in Pasadena. They are perfectly safe. They are eating ice cream and watching cartoons, completely unaware that their parents are currently being evicted for staging a fraudulent coup. I may be a ruthless accountant, but I am not a monster. I made sure the kids were shielded from the consequences of your massive stupidity. DeAndre, realizing that his wife was completely paralyzed by panic, tried to deploy his signature charm. He straightened his designer track jacket and took a cautious step toward the police officer, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. Look, Officer, DeAndre began, flashing his $1,000,000 smile. This is just a massive misunderstanding between grieving siblings. We are a good family. We are just working through a complicated probate issue. There is absolutely no need to escalate this to an eviction. Let me just call my lawyer and we can sort this out tomorrow morning over a cup of coffee. Captain Miller did not smile back. He did not relax his stance. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his uniform and pulled out a folded sheaf of official court documents. He held them up into the elaborate purple patio lighting. We are not just here for an eviction tonight, Mr. Adams, Captain Miller stated, his voice dropping an octave. The eviction is simply a civil courtesy to clear the property. My primary operational objective here tonight is the execution of a high-level criminal arrest warrant. DeAndre froze, his smile vanishing instantly. His hands dropped slowly to his sides. A criminal warrant, he repeated, his voice cracking. For what, exactly? Captain Miller unfolded the thick legal papers, reading directly from the sworn affidavit. I have a signed warrant from a Superior Court judge for the immediate arrest of DeAndre Marcus Washington. You are being charged with 3 counts of first-degree wire fraud, 2 counts of felony forgery, and 1 massive count of elder financial abuse. The officer paused, letting the severity of the charges hang heavily in the cool California air. The district attorney has been reviewing a comprehensive forensic dossier provided by your sister-in-law. We have the offshore bank routing numbers. We have the IP addresses you used to create the fake corporate invoices. We have the fraudulent crypto exchange ledgers. And most importantly, we have the revoked notary stamp you used to forge the final will and testament of Thomas and Susan Adams. The mention of the forensic dossier was the final nail in the coffin. DeAndre looked at me, his eyes burning with a mixture of profound hatred and absolute terror. He finally realized that I had not just spent the last 2 years quietly doing my job. I had spent the last 2 years meticulously building the exact cage he was about to spend the next decade inside. You set me up, DeAndre hissed, his voice dripping with venom. You sat at our dinner table and let me take that money. You knew the whole time and you just watched me do it. I did not set you up, DeAndre, I replied, my voice echoing with absolute finality. I simply documented your behavior. You stole from my parents. You drained their retirement accounts to buy luxury cars and custom suits. You manipulated them to fund your lazy lifestyle. I did not make you a criminal. I just ensured the government had the perfect paper trail. Captain Miller signaled, and 2 uniformed officers materialized from the shadows. They walked briskly toward DeAndre. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, Captain Miller commanded, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. DeAndre panicked. The visionary broke down. He scrambled backward, bumping the fireplace. No, wait, he yelled, throwing his hands up defensively. It was not just me. Audrey knew about it. She calculated the balances. She is an accomplice, Audrey shrieked, stepping away quickly. Turn around now, Captain Miller barked, drawing his taser. DeAndre slowly turned around. The 2 backup officers grabbed his arms, pulling them forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed across the silent patio. It was the absolute loudest sound of the entire night. They patted him down, removing the keys to the luxury cars he had leased using my parents' stolen credit cards. The final blow had been struck, perfectly ending the charade. DeAndre was led away down the sprawling driveway, his head bowed in absolute defeat. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers illuminated the crushed landscaping, reflecting off the scattered garbage bags that still contained my ruined clothing. It was a fitting visual for the end of his fraudulent reign. Audrey watched her husband being stuffed into the back of a squad car. She did not run after him. She did not scream his name or profess her undying loyalty. The illusion of their perfect marriage shattered the moment the stolen money finally completely disappeared from them forever. She turned back to me, her face streaked with ruined makeup and tears of genuine terror. She looked at the sprawling mansion, the luxury cars she no longer owned, and the empty patio that had just hosted the absolute worst night of her life. "Claire, please," Audrey begged, dropping to her knees on the cold stone tile. "You have to help me. I have absolutely nothing left. The credit cards are maxed out. I do not have a job. I do not even have a checking account in my own name. How am I supposed to survive out there tomorrow? How am I supposed to feed my children? I cannot go to jail for forgery. I am a mother. You have to drop the charges and give me the house." I looked down at the sister who had spent her entire life tormenting me. I felt no anger anymore. I only felt a profound sense of closure. "I am not pressing charges, Audrey." I explained, my voice perfectly calm. "The state of California is pressing charges because you committed federal crimes. I cannot stop the district attorney from prosecuting forgery and elder abuse. As for your current living situation today, you will have to figure that out on your own. You have a communications degree. I highly suggest you update your resume and start looking for an entry-level position. You can pack up your little bags and find a nice, quiet studio apartment downtown." Those were your exact words to me 12 hours ago. I suggest you follow your own advice. I turned my back on her and walked toward the house. Brian was already gone, having slipped out through the side gate into the dark canyon night. He left his rental car parked in the massive driveway outside. He preferred to walk miles down the winding road rather than face me again. He would wake up tomorrow to a shattered career and insurmountable commercial debt. Audrey remained on the patio, sobbing into her hands as the catering staff quietly began packing up the uneaten caviar. The next morning was incredibly efficient. Captain Miller arranged for Audrey to be escorted off the property. She was allowed to pack 2 suitcases of essential clothing before vacating the premises. The luxury cars were impounded by the local leasing agencies without delay. The expensive custom furniture items were seized by my business. They were liquidated by my corporate entity to offset the debt left on the mortgage. Audrey moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a rough neighborhood, leaning heavily on our Aunt Diane for basic groceries. 3 weeks later, Audrey was officially indicted for her role in the forgery and the financial abuse of our parents. Because she cooperated with the federal investigators and testified against DeAndre, she avoided a lengthy prison sentence and received 5 years of strict probation. DeAndre was not so lucky. The judge denied him bail. He is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary awaiting trial. He is facing a minimum of 15 years behind bars. His fake empire collapsed completely, leaving him with nothing but a standard orange jumpsuit and a public defender who hates him. As for me, I did not stay in the Calabasas mansion. The house held too many toxic memories of my parents' enabling and my sister's profound cruelty. I formally foreclosed on the property through my investment company and sold it to a prominent local real estate developer for a substantial profit. I took those funds along with my personal savings and bought a beautiful modern luxury penthouse residence immediately. It was located in downtown Los Angeles, overlooking the glowing city skyline. 6 months after that chaotic night, I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my new home, holding a cup of hot black coffee. The sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean, casting brilliant streaks of gold and violet across the vast California sky. The air was cool and incredibly clean. For the first time in my entire life, I felt completely free. The heavy burden of being the unloved scapegoat was entirely gone. I no longer had to navigate the exhausting emotional minefield of toxic family members. I had surgically removed the infection, and the healing process was spectacular. But I knew my work was not entirely finished. The $8.5 million sitting safely inside the irrevocable trust was secure, but I did not need it to live a fulfilling life. I had my own successful career and my own wealth. I realized that the best way to honor the painful lessons of my past was to ensure no one else had to fight those battles entirely alone. Using the funds from the trust, I officially established the Adams Financial Justice Foundation today and forever. It is a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing elite forensic accounting and legal defense services to vulnerable individuals. We hire top-tier investigators to track hidden assets and expose predators hiding behind the family mask. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own future? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more authentic stories of resilience and legal revenge. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder today. Thank you for listening today. The story of Claire's meticulous dismantling of her family's fraudulent empire offers a profound lesson on the power of emotional detachment and financial literacy when dealing with toxic relationships. Often, when betrayed by those closest to us, especially family members or romantic partners, our first instinct is to react with raw emotion. We want to scream, cry, or demand immediate explanations. However, Claire's journey demonstrates that yielding to emotional outbursts only gives manipulators the validation and control they desperately crave. Instead of breaking down on the driveway when her belongings were tossed aside, Claire leaned into logic, facts, and preparation. The crucial takeaway here is that boundaries are most effective when backed by undeniable action rather than just verbal arguments. Her sister Audrey and brother-in-law DeAndre built their entire existence on the illusion of wealth and the exploitation of familial guilt. They weaponized the concept of family to excuse their overwhelming greed and entitlement. Claire countered this not by playing their chaotic game, but by stepping outside of it entirely. By utilizing her professional knowledge to secure her parents' assets in an irrevocable trust and quietly purchasing the defaulted mortgage, she built an impenetrable fortress around her future. This narrative teaches us that we are not obligated to set ourselves on fire to keep our toxic family members warm. It is entirely possible and often necessary to walk away from people who view our kindness as a weakness to be exploited. Knowledge is power. But applied knowledge combined with the emotional discipline to let abusers dig their own graves is absolute liberation. When we detach from the need for toxic approval, we reclaim our lives and our peace. If you found this lesson valuable, please share this reflection with someone who might need the courage to establish their own unshakable boundaries today.